Welcome to week 13, Expanding an Empire and the Debate over Slavery. By the 1840s, as Frederick Douglass had used another man's free papers to escape to the North, slavery moved to the center of American politics. It did so not in the moral language or with the urgent program of abolitionism, but as a result of the nation's territorial expansion. In the first half of the 19th century, most white Americans viewed the westward march of settlement as a renewable source of energy, hope, and yearning. Henry David Thoreau exclaimed that Americans, quote, "go westward as into the future, with the spirit of enterprise and adventure, and the hope of freedom." During the 1840s and after, waves of people moved westward. Pioneers moved west largely for economic reasons. Enterprising trappers, farmers, miners, merchants, clerks, hunters, ranchers, teachers, household servants, and prostitutes, among others, headed west to seek their fortunes. By 1860, some 4.3 million people had traversed the mile-wide Mississippi River and streamed across the Great Plains and Rocky Mountains to the Pacific coast. Of course, the West was not an empty land. Others had been there long before the American migration. The Native American and Hispanic inhabitants of the region, however, soon found themselves swept aside as U.S. presidents and congressmen encouraged the nation's continental expansion. Westward expansion was especially important to Southerners, many of whom viewed the new territories as a source of cheap land on which to grow cotton using slave labor. Such motives made the addition of Western lands a flashpoint of sectional debate. Would the new Western territories be slave or free? In 1845, New York newspaper editor John L. O'Sullivan gave a catchy name to the nation's aggressive expansion. "Our manifest destiny," he wrote, "is to overspread and to possess the whole of the continent with which Providence has given us." O'Sullivan spoke for many who wanted to take control of all of North America. The idea of manifest destiny assumed that the United States had a God-given mission to extend its republic and capitalist civilization from the Atlantic to the Pacific and beyond. This notion of manifest destiny offered a moral justification for territorial growth and the expansion of slavery. However idealized, though, manifest destiny was in essence a cluster of flimsy rationalizations and racist attitudes justifying the conquest of weaker peoples. The American passion for new Western land focused largely on Texas, an area of rich soil, lush prairie grass, plentiful timber, and abundant wildlife. During the 1820s, the United States had twice offered to buy Texas, but the Mexican government refused to sell. Mexicans were frightened and infuriated by the idea of Yankees taking their sacred soil, but that is what happened. By 1823, some 3,000 Americans, or Tayans, called Anglos, were living in Texas illegally. Americans who rushed to settle into land developer Stephen Fuller Austin's Anglo colony each received 177 free acres and had access to thousands of acres of common pasture for ranching. Most of the Anglos were ranchers or farmers drawn to the fertile, inexpensive lands in the river valleys. An American reported that eastern Texas was, quote, "literally alive with all kinds of game. We have only to go out a few miles into a swamp to find as many wild cattle as one could wish," end quote. There were as many buffalo as cattle. By 1830, coastal Texas had far more Americans than Tejanos, that's Spanish-speaking Texans. It also had far more Americans than Indians. In fact, about 20,000 white settlers and enslaved blacks who were brought to grow and harvest cotton lived there. The flood of Americans into Texas led to numerous clashes with Indians as well as with Mexican officials, who began having second thoughts about their tolerated guests. A Mexican congressman issued an accurate warning in 1830. He said, quote, "Mexicans, watch closely, for you know all too well the Anglo-Saxon greed for territory. We have generously granted land to these Nordics. They have made their home with us, but their hearts are with their native land. We are continually in civil wars and revolutions. We are weak and we know it, and they know it also. They may conspire with the United States to take Texas from us. From this time, be on your guard," end quote. Mexican officials were so worried about the intentions of the Tayans that in April 1830 they outlawed further emigration from the United States. Americans who viewed the Mexicans with contempt kept coming anyway as illegal immigrants. By 1835, the Tayans and their enslaved blacks outnumbered the Tejanos 10-1. A changing political situation aggravated the growing tensions between the Mexican government and the Tayans. In 1834, General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, the Mexican president, suspended the National Congress and became a dictator, calling himself the Napoleon of the West. Texans feared that Santa Anna planned to free, quote, our slaves and to make slaves of us. When Santa Anna imprisoned Stephen Austin for inciting rebelliousness among the Tayans, American settlers decided that the Mexican ruler had to go. Upon his release 18 months later, Austin called for Texans to revolt. He said, quote, war is our only resource. There is no other remedy. He urged that Texas become a fully American territory promoting slavery and then officially become a new state. In the fall of 1835, Texans rebelled against Santa Anna's despotism. The Mexican leader ordered all Americans expelled, all Texans disarmed, and all rebels arrested and executed as pirates. As the first sporadic fights of the Texas Revolt erupted, hundreds of armed volunteers from southern states rushed to assist the 30,000 Tayans and Tejanos fighting against a Mexican nation of 7 million people. At San Antonio, the provincial capital in southern Texas, General Santa Anna's 3,000-man army assaulted a group of fewer than 200 Tayans, Tejanos, and members of the Texas Volunteer Army holed up in an abandoned Catholic mission called the Alamo. The defenders of the Alamo shared a commitment to liberty in the face of Santa Anna's growing despotism. In late February 1836, Santa Anna demanded the Alamo surrender. By then, the commander of the Alamo was William Barrett Travis, who said, quote, I shall never surrender or retreat, victory or death. The ferocious fighting at the Alamo turned the rebellion into a war for Texan independence. On March 2, 1836, delegates from all 59 Texan towns met in the tiny village of Washington on the Brazos, some 150 miles north of San Antonio. There, they signed a Declaration of Independence and drafted a constitution for the new Republic of Texas. The climactic battle of the Alamo was fought in pre-dawn dark. Santa Anna's men attacked from every direction. They were twice forced back, but on the third try, they broke through the battered north wall. Travis was killed by a bullet between the eyes. In the end, virtually all of the Texans were killed or wounded. Those who survived the battle were ordered hacked to death with swords. A Mexican officer wrote that the captives, quote, died without complaining and without humiliating themselves before their torturers. The Battle of the Alamo provided a rallying cry for vengeful Tayans. While Santa Anna proclaimed a glorious victory, his aide wrote ominously in his diary, quote, one more such glorious victory and we are finished. After learning of the Mexican victory at the Alamo, Sam Houston, a rowdy, larger-than-life frontier statesman, led his outnumbered troops on a long strategic retreat to buy time, while hoping that Santa Anna's pursuing army would make a mistake. In late spring 1836, the cocky Mexican general let his guard down. Houston's army of 900 fighters caught Santa Anna's 1,600 troops napping near the San Jacinto River, about 25 miles southeast of the modern city of Houston. The Tayans and Tejanos charged, yelling, remember the Alamo. They overwhelmed the Mexicans. The battle lasted only 18 minutes, but Houston's troops spent the next 2 hours slaughtering fleeing Mexican soldiers. Santa Anna escaped, but was captured the next day. He bought his freedom by signing a treaty recognizing the independence of the Republic of Texas, with the Rio Grande as its southern boundary with Mexico. The Texas Revolt had been accomplished in just 7 weeks. In 1836, the Lone Star Republic, as Tayans called their new nation, legalized slavery, banned free blacks, elected Sam Houston as its first president, and voted overwhelmingly for annexation to the United States. But statehood for Texas soon became embroiled in the sectional debate over slavery. President Andrew Jackson eagerly wanted Texas to join the Union. He knew, however, that adding Texas as a slave state would ignite an explosive quarrel between North and South that would fracture the Democratic Party and endanger the election of New Yorker Martin Van Buren, his hand-picked successor. Worse, any effort to add Texas to the Union would likely mean a war with Mexico, which refused to recognize Texan independence. So, Jackson delayed official recognition of the Republic of Texas until his last day in office, early in 1837. Van Buren, Jackson's successor, did as predicted. He avoided all talk of Texas annexation during his single term as president. And in the next part of our video, we will talk about the election of 1844 and the presidency of James K. Polk.